Let's see. Hello to a brand new episode of Cabbie Conversations. We haven't done one of these in a while, but I'm here with the usual James. And
Hello.
hello. And today we're going to be talking about LGBTQ plus rights, and more specifically, maybe towards the end, we're going to talk about a practice called conversion therapy. Like what it is and why it's wrong and stuff, because that's kind of done some research about that. So yeah, would you like to start off by with anything in particular, or should we just like go right in?
I think what's interesting about LGBT rights is, well, I think there is a separation between rights to do with sexuality and rights to do with gender identity. I do think there is, and I think we're seeing it now, like the rights, I think, from mainly focusing on lesbian, gay, and bisexual people who aren't trans. There's that sort of disagreement, if you like, frustrations with like legal frustrations start off far earlier in history, and I think the discussion about trans people has only really come into the fore well, legally in the UK in the last 20 years.
Yeah.
Whereas I think it's been a problem being gay as soon as Christianity was introduced into the UK,
Yeah.
by the Romans, and that's what sort of changed it. The first act was the Buggery Act of 1535, which was when two men having sex was punishable by death. It's quite interesting, and lots of laws to do with gay rights, it focuses on men because women aren't really attributed to be able to do those things because they were almost viewed as property. And if you look at the Bible, which we'll get onto later, again we see that women are sort of viewed as property, so these laws often are only viewed at in like a masculine view. But again, trans rights are, I think trans sort of gets lumped with being gay because I think up until recently people didn't really realize there was a difference due to like a certain amount of drag culture, and there being quite a lot of crossover. People I don't think quite understood the nuances.
Well, certainly when it was first becoming an issue, medically, I guess you'd say, I think that was the assumption where, if a man specifically was expressing feminine traits or like saying that they identified more with women, I think that was the assumption, wasn't it, that they were gay. It wasn't really assumed that there was something else entirely. But you brought up a good point in the sense of like, I think there's kind of a misconception about gay rights in the sense of like, basically in recent years it's become more modernized, and everything before that it was very, everyone was against it. But I think there's a certain element of like, it wasn't really in the general knowledge of sphere, if that makes sense.
No.
It wasn't thought of. I mean, certainly not lesbians. That's only become a thing in recent years, in recent decades. There's a famous quote by Queen Victoria saying she didn't think it was like possible for it to exist. And I think that's the thing, is that it's like in ancient times, like before the real influx of Christianity into England and other places as well, it wasn't really seen as an issue because no one really knew about it.
The Greeks thought being homosexual made you a better warrior, and then there was the Amazonians, who were a tribe of rather savage terrifying female warriors,
Yeah.
homosexuality was kind of respected and revered in some cultures.
Right.
It's the birth and the spread of Christianity and these sort of, I say, Abrahamic religions
Yes.
that uprooted, I guess, this a tolerance of homosexuality.
Absolutely. Certainly the religions that arose from the Middle East, so mainly Christianity and Islam.
And
Yeah. But there's even evidence to a certain extent. Again, it's like that the Bible, obviously, again, it portrays a narrative of men and women in terms of that being the marital acceptance, but even the famous line about "Thou shalt not lie with a man as with a woman" has been through. The Bible gets translated many times. There is theories that even then it's not necessarily incompatible with the Bible. It's just something that lies outside it.
There's translations that say that thou shalt not lie as a boy, as meaning a boy, instead of actually meaning I think because the previous language, maybe it was Greek or whatever, was gendered. So, or the Latin translation was gendered into like being a young boy, and then that was just translated into man instead of, say, following the age. So thou should not lie with. So it got translated as thou should not lie with a man, when maybe it was thou should not lie with a child. But again, like customs to do with marriage and stuff, and when people got married and when people had children was so different 500, 600 years ago. It like you were considered a man aged 15 in the UK. Like we've had male child kings who've reigned as in the from like what's it, King Henry VIII's son, I've forgotten his name. Edward VI. He was less than 15 when he became king.
Yeah.
But he was allowed to reign as an adult. So the definition of what we consider an adult has changed, and so it's therefore very easy to see how that has got lost in translation.
Absolutely. And there's no one translation of the Bible that exists, certainly into English. But I mean, either way, I think it's important to acknowledge that, well, there's two parts of what I guess I'm trying to say. It's like, one, the homophobia and transphobia I don't think is necessarily an inherent human condition, if that makes sense. Like, it's not necessarily something that is like inevitable. And secondly, that it's religion, the influx of religion. And I don't want to bash the religion too much, because I'm going to do it a lot in this episode. But yeah, I guess I should make clear I don't have any problem with religion generally. But these are these are pretty much undisputed historical facts.
I don't have a problem with religion, but I think that because religion is formed of ancient texts, it often the sentiments can be taken out of context. And if I was to provide an example for this, there's two stories which are kind of very similar. There's the story of Sodom, which is in Genesis. We'll start with that one. Genesis is Genesis, for people who want to know. Genesis chapter 19, verses 1 to 11. And in the story, I'm not going to read it word for word, but two angels come to the city of Sodom, and a man called Lot accepts them, gives them food, washes their feet, which was like a sign of hospitality in that period, in that time, and gives them shelter. They were like, no, we'll sleep on the streets, and they were like, no, let you take us in. And basically all these men from the city surround the house and say, let these men out, we want to rape them.
Shit.
Come out and Sodom and Lot says, no, you can have my virgin daughter instead.
Oh my god. Let me guess, Sodom's the hero of the story.
So Sodom is actually the city. Sorry, Lot is the hero,
Oh,
but
sorry, yeah.
and then because of I don't know, I can't quite remember how, but basically the angels rescue. I think Lot becomes outcast from the city, but the angels protected him from death because he refused to let these people in his city rape two strangers meant. But it's still, look, it shows you like how like men can be raped, but it's not the same for a woman because women are
No.
property. Like it just kind of shows how again it's viewed that women are not possible to be gay. It's not possible for women to be gay, but also like they are just property and they can be raped.
Yeah.
So
Exactly.
and
Jesus.
the story of Gibeah in Judges chapter 19 again, and verses 16 to 24. Similar story. A man, Gibeah takes in a traveler, who's travelled he's travelling back from Bethlehem to his hometown, and the town again surround the house and say we want to have sex with the traveler, and Gibeah says no. But you can rape my daughter who's a virgin and his concubine. Like
What the fuck? It's the
it,
exact same story.
it's the same story. Um, it kind of just shows that like but it kind of just shows again that maybe and this kind of set maybe it's this sense of xenophobia, this sense of uncertainty instead because these people who are given hospitality are strangers, so there's a
Mm.
suspicion of them, and so maybe that was a cultural thing that rape was you I don't was
Yeah,
used as
I
ability.
think it is like an aggressive thing back then. I don't know. It's weird.
Maybe it was that, or maybe it was I don't know a very ancient form of cruising. I'm not really sure. um, I am definitely not a theological scholar, but it's very I find it very
Yeah,
strange.
yeah. I think that's
um,
fair enough.
and again, it kind of views like women as property and therefore not on parity to men.
Mm.
Um, and I think this kind of comes into again kind of comes into law because so in as early as so as we there was the Offences Act against the Person of 1861, which stopped sex being punishable by death but prison. And then in 1885, this was reformed to all gay activity, homosexual activity. But in 1947, there was 57, sorry, there was something called the Wolfton Report, which was supported by the Archbishop at the time, Geoffrey Fisher, and it said that whoever consenting adults can have sex as long as it is private, and they're of a suitable age. And this came into the 1967 Sexual Offences Act, where public gay sex is still illegal, but consensual private sex for those who are over 21 becomes legal. Um, this kind of this is maybe more of a so I think this is against becomes increasingly just against public indecency, and although there is still an anti-gay sentiment, I wonder what hang up there is from the Bible. I don't know, that could be complete nonsense. And also yeah uh
Yeah,
um if it's consensual, if it's there it's I think this issue of like privacy and like consent is like it's just it becomes very key um in again, and like it then the next few major laws become about consent and reducing the age of consent until it's equalized in 2001. um
yes, I know. It was a big thing, certainly culturally. Um, Gay men specifically were seen as like predatorial towards young men. I think that's why the age of consent was higher for gay
yeah,
men than it was
viewed
for
as
straight.
pedophiles and
Yeah, there's an
perverts.
interesting case called The Crown versus Brown. If anyone wants to look it up, it's a pretty interesting case. it's not necessarily about homophobia or anything, but it's like a 1998 case, and it's about these these gay guys who had like basically a sex dungeon, and everyone was consensual to it. Everyone was over 18 or 16, I think. I think one person was 17, and it was basically like really rough S&M stuff. And it was actually, nobody complained about it. It was not like a public thing at all. And yet they actually got charged with it, like basically committing GBH. It's a very interesting case. GBH, grievous bodily harm. As it basically, ABH is like general, I can't remember the exact distinctions, but it's like GBH is essentially like grievous wounds, like there's a chance that you'll die. ABH is kind of just like, you'll get injured, but not a chance that you'll die. So, and I think homophobia, but the reason I'm bringing this up is because I think homophobia played a big part in it.
Yeah.
And specifically, there's the fact that one of them was 17, and then they placed a lot of emphasis on that, how they thought he was being groomed and all this stuff, even though technically he was over 16, which is the legal age in the UK.
But that was not the legal age at the time for gay sex.
Maybe it was definitely it definitely wasn't pedophilic. I can't remember exactly the details of it, but anyway, yeah, it's.
The age of consent was changed in 1994 from 21 to 18, but in 2001 the age of consent was equalised to 16.
Okay. Yeah, it's a very interesting one to look up, and yeah, I think there is a lot of hangover from, because we are a very, we're basically a Judeo-Christian nation, whether we like still, that's our core. I'll get into that a bit later, but our laws and our general societal morals are very much still based in Christianity. We're probably more progressive than some countries, and we're certainly not like a religious state, I guess you'd say. But it's to find where we draw distinctions and where our laws come from. It does come a lot from the Bible.
Well, I think a lot of it brings in our conservatism, because we're often not the first country to make changes to LGBT rights. Yeah. We often wait for several other countries, to make changes to rights before we ourselves decide to make changes to rights. We often wait for the US and Australia, and in particular, to have made changes to rights before we make changes to rights.
Yes, I mean, even it's mad to think, did America legalize? No, we legalized gay marriage first, right?
Multiple states in the US had legalized gay marriage before us.
Yeah. Yes, exactly.
And it was the same with women's rights. Multiple states in the US had given women rights, and several other countries had given women rights before the UK gave women rights. And I think it's part of this conservatism, part of us being having a religious head of state, that keeps us from progressing in the rights of LGBT people more quickly. When Justin Welby, the current Archbishop of Canterbury, so the head of the church, the Anglican Church, he's very on the fence about the whole thing. He's not committing to either side of the cause with regards to making gay marriage in the Anglican Church recognised. It's currently recognised in the Baptist Church, but in our state church it's not recognised, and he's on the he says he agonises over it, which basically is very non-committal. He also says the same on there's more recently being an affirmation service similar to a baptism but not quite, for trans people to be new name to be reintroduced to the church. And again, he says that you can ignore the affirmation if you don't want to, which is again giving churches the option of being inclusive to LGBT people or not inclusive to LGBT people. And I think this is what allows hostility to very much still, I'd say, germinate and thrive in Christian communities in the UK. Christianity
Definitely.
still being the dominant religion here.
Yeah.
And I think coupled with austerity, it increasingly, or these days, leads to an anti-trans sentiment because everyone is stressed and it's easier to feed in these and these negative thoughts into the general population.
Yeah. I think so. I mean, I think maybe part of the reason, I don't know, that people are more hostile towards expanding trans rights compared to sexuality rights is that you know, ultimately giving LGBT people greater rights doesn't really affect most people. I think I'm sure one of us has heard the phrase in their lifetime, you know, or what they do behind in their own house doesn't matter to me, you know. I think that's fair enough. Like, most people don't really care what's going on in people's private lives. And the same is true of trans people, to be honest, but it's obviously more obvious, I suppose you could say, if you sometimes in public. But the main thing is, like you say, it's austerity. It's very easy to point fingers at who's spending all the money, you know, and you hear and on certain questionable news sources might point the blame at how the NHS spends lots of money on trans surgeries and all this sort of stuff. The difference between, you know, I get the difference is, you know, it's the difference between a negative right and a positive right. A negative right basically just says the state and nobody else should intervene with your rights. Positive right is saying that you deserve this level of lifestyle or livelihood and you need money and resources in order to get to that point.
I would agree about the money and resources thing, but I don't think it's the main cause for the hysteria around trans people. I think it's
I don't think so either.
I think it's the medicalization. Like, LGBT people were previously seen as mentally ill, and that has been removed. That myth has been debunked, but there is still a heavy sentiment and heavy belief that trans people are mentally ill, even though it is no longer, because to be diagnosed as trans up until the DSM-4, it was when you were having gender dysphoria was viewed as being you had to be diagnosed as mentally ill to then receive treatment as a transgender person. So there is still very much this sentiment that trans people are mentally ill and therefore not safe. That's where I think that, like, people become cautious and like, of course, it's not true that trans people are mentally ill, but the frustration and the difficulties for accessing treatments do make trans people ill. Stonewall has found that trans and non-binary mental health is dreadful. 46% of trans people and 50% of non-binary people have considered taking their own lives in 2018. So that's just 4 years ago. And since 2000, and when YouGov has basically looked at the people's sentiments towards trans people, it has gone down. It's becoming more negative from 2018 to 2022. So there is a hostility towards trans people, and it makes people, of course, if you're degraded on a daily basis, you're going to have bad mental health, you're going to have eating disorders, you're going to have anxiety, you're going to experience depression, and if accessing health is difficult, that is also going to make you mentally ill.
Yeah.
So currently in the UK, about 2/5 of people support trans people, um, uh, but most people do not want to make the legal process for supporting trans people any more straightforward.
Yeah.
So but you can be what you want, but like you said, because it's not because transition in its nature cannot be private, it is therefore not something the public want to make easier for trans people, and it makes trans people still second class citizens in a way that LGBT people are. It's becoming increasingly easier for them to access rights. For most recently, with lesbians being able to have access to fertility treatment
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
in the NHS.
Yeah. I mean, that's a very recent thing, isn't it? Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think there's one of the potential cause, I guess you could say, is this whole. There's very much a narrative about like trans people invading certain spaces.
Mm.
This is kind of a it's almost like um, not really a conservative argument. It's more of a turf argument, like um, L specifically people who are like very strong LGBT activists and feminist activists, but like anti-trans. I mean, I'm sure people know about like the bathroom problem and like the whole issue around like whether trans.
Access
Yeah,
accessing domestic violence spaces for trans
yeah.
women.
Which of course, I mean, I guess just to hit this nail on the head while we're there. Like, first of all, it's very much based. Look, I'm a man, so that's like you could argue that I don't know what I'm talking about and I have no skin in the game. But um, I think if we were looking at it objectively, right, these fears about trans people invading certain spaces, maybe they're to a greater or less extent we could say they're understandable. However, I don't think that they are objectively in any way founded in reality. What
Yeah.
people are really afraid of is men, not trans women, invading these spaces. Um, they specifically toilets. I mean, the idea that a trans woman would invade a toilet, whereas a guy, a man, a cis man could easily do the same if he was going to commit a crime anyway.
I mean, why, go to all the hassle of being a trans woman and
Mm,
shaving and get I don't know, wearing makeup and wearing tights and I don't know all the rest when he
yeah.
could put on a high vis jacket and
Yes.
just walk in.
Yeah. Wear a caretaker uniform. You know, every public toilet you go to says this is cleaned by male and female staff. That would be a
That
much better disguise, wouldn't it?
that's a much easier way of infiltrating the space without being questioned than a trans woman.
Yeah.
If you look ambiguous in a gendered, especially a women's toilet, you will be called out for it.
Yeah.
So, it is far easier to openly present as a man and behave in a sinister way than
Yeah.
it is to come across as trans feminine. It's
Yeah.
far more difficult. Um,
Absolutely. I think the bottom line for this our whole argument is that I think these fears are just they're essentially just fear mongering that has found it's irrational fear mongering that has found a sort of narrative that is easier to push on the general public, if that makes sense. It's like when in a few decades ago about the whole eugenics argument. It's basically a way of people who are in some way intolerant, um, that they find a way to rationalize it.
well, definitely it because feminists don't want to be reduced to their biological function of bodies.
Yeah,
But by excluding trans women, you're doing that exactly.
yeah,
You're saying
y-
because that person was born with a penis, they are not a woman, and I am a woman. When you're basically doing what you don't want. Saying not all women are fertile, not all women can, not all women can have children, not
all
all
women
women
want
want
children. Yeah,
not all women want children, not all women want to be stay-at-home mothers. But because that person who can't do any of that, maybe can't do many of those things, was not in society's eyes, born a woman, therefore she does not have the privilege to access female spaces. And this again comes down to the stigma and the stereotype that trans women in particular are mentally ill, but have a masculine, a strong, aggressive masculine form, and therefore are unpredictable and dangerous, when this
Yeah.
is just simply not the case.
It's viewing them as a man, isn't it, basically? You're not viewing them as a woman at all. Again, I think that the fear is of men, not of trans women, but they view trans women as men. And I think one last thing I'll say about this is, again, coming from a man, so take it from a pinch of salt. It's like there's more commonality with trans women and cis women than there is differences. Both experience discrimination, both experience domestic violence at an increased rate compared to cis men, and so it's and obviously most often at the hands of cis men. So there really is no reason to be against each other. We should be for each other, if anything. So yeah, I mean that's what I have to say about that whole thing. Did you have anything else about that?
No, I don't have anything else to say about that.
Okay, and in that case, I think we can move on to talking about conversion therapy. So yeah, I guess we should start by saying what is conversion therapy, for those who don't know. It's basically any practice that aims to change someone's sexual orientation or gender identity. Now, obviously, usually this is from being some variation of LGBTIQ plus to being straight and cisgender. So essentially, that's the broad term, but it can cover a lot of different practices. I think the two main examples are ones that occur in a faith setting and ones that occur in a clinical setting, specifically like a psychologist, psychiatric setting. So they both have their own like aspects. In faith settings, it can come in the form of like exorcisms at a most extreme level, or it can come in the most of the time it comes from some sort of talking therapy.
Support.
Yeah, but in the faith setting, it's very much rooted in the idea. It's obviously based in biblical teachings or some sort of religious teaching. Essentially, this is what the Bible or the Quran or whatever says, and you have to follow it, and it's based in that sort of thing. And that's the most common form of conversion therapy that occurs. In a clinical setting, it's slightly different, where no sort of psychologist or any medical professional is ever going to say that they offer conversion therapy. They're never going to use those words. What they will say is that they offer, therapy that helps people deal with their unwanted sexual desires, is a very common one used. And a lot of the time it goes into past trauma, relationships with your parents. Essentially, it tries to find some sort of cause of being gay or being non-gender conforming, and tries to basically help you in quotation marks deal with that and overcome that. But yeah, I mean, did you have any preliminary thoughts or anything about conversion therapy? Because I could probably talk about it for a long time, so I have many to not talk too much.
What are my thoughts on conversion therapy? Well, I think conversion therapy again kind of ties up into this religious hysteria that somebody is wrong, and like the sanctity of a marriage between a man and a woman, and like marriage being everything. I think when the conversion therapy ban was brought in, when interviewed, the evangelical group, a British evangelical group, said it would hinder our religious freedom to encourage chastity. So this is again kind of promoting the idea back to those like stories in the Old Testament that homosexuality is ravaging and it's dangerous and it's violent, and that it does not promote it doesn't support the chastity and the unity of like family, and the
Yeah.
promotion of family and the promotion of community. It sees it as a destruction of community.
Yeah, I definitely want to get back to the whole religious debate after this, because yeah, it comes back to what we were talking about earlier, and it comes back to lots of people's objections to banning conversion therapy. But I first want to make it kind of clear why conversion therapy is like wrong generally. I suppose the most important maybe thing to say is that it doesn't work. There's no scientific any evidence to show that conversion therapy does what it aims to do. There's been lots of psychology studies into sexual identity and gender identity, and the general consensus among the scientific community right now is that your sexual and gender identity is not static. It changes over the course of your life, and can change when it most often changes when you're young, from being one to the other, and then you stick with it. But it can be very fluid. It can be you have a short phase in your 20s, and then that's it, and or you can realize that you're LGBT when you're 60. There's no real explanation as to why it is, but most commonly it's relating to hormones. In any case, there's no evidence to show that you can, through any sort of external intervention, change your sexuality or your gender identity. So it's good to put that on the table first, I guess. And but also at the same time, I think it's good to say that even if it did work in some way, that it would still be wrong, because it causes significant. There's obviously more extreme examples of it where it causes physical harm. I know certainly back in the day, electroshock therapy was used, and that has all sorts of problems in terms of causing convulsions and stuff like that. But realistically speaking, most conversion therapy doesn't take a physical form. It's very much based in talking therapy.
Or
but
hormones. Or Alan Turing.
Traditionally, yeah, hormone, of course, which of course has its own.
Which Alan Turing was subjected to.
Yeah, of course. No, that's definitely worth noting as well, which can cause obviously lack of sexual functioning, depression, and so on. Yeah, if you haven't seen the Imitation Game, and you want to be upset, watch that movie, because goddamn, that's a sad one. But we were talking earlier about how trans people it should also be said of LGBT people as well. Depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation. These things are very common in these communities. I think because of societal rejection of these identities. These things are only exacerbated when someone goes through conversion therapy, because basically you're told that the thoughts you have are wrong at a very basic level. Being told that your most basic desire that you can't do anything about is wrong, and you should be punished for it. It creates all these horrible complexes in people, which leads to greater suicidal ideation, loss of sexual functioning. I was going to say, yeah, the only evidence of stuff that you can do, that conversion therapy does do, is sort of suppress your sexuality, which is obviously not the same as changing it, and which of course suppressing your sexuality causes its own problems. It means that you aren't able to have a sexually fulfilling life at all. You know, you could be married, and yes, you might torture yourself every day and be able to not find men attractive, but it doesn't mean that you're going to find women attractive. Therefore, you know, it's not. All it does is make it so you don't feel anything, which of course is not good for your mental health at all. So yeah, I mean, and that's basically it. But even, I think, from a legal point of view as well, just a general societal point of view, like the fact that it exists and the fact that it technically is illegal in some forms, you know, it permeates the idea that you were talking about, like that the LGBT people are in some way mentally ill or in some way wrong. You know, they need fixing in some way, and even if it's a frowned upon practice in the medical community, I think that the fact that if it's allowed to exist, that idea will always just be in the background of general societal notions about sexuality and gender identity.
Yeah. And I have an incomplete ban. So currently, lesbian, gay, and bisexual people are banned, but trans people are not protected. However, just because somebody doesn't transition to be straight, that is not how it works.
That's the opposite normally.
Some people, there is no sort of real correlation. Trans people tend to display a wider variation in sexualities compared to the cis people, and so a trans person or a non-binary person or a gender questioning person could have questions about their gender identity, but could also have questions about their sexuality, and this could mean that this could be, you know, that they are in fact a butch lesbian, for example, or an effeminate gay man, but the gender presentation could be represented as a trans issue, and therefore they then get LGBT people still suffer from, are still condemned to or pressured into conversion therapy, as well as trans people. An incomplete ban does not protect the LGBT community from conversion therapy.
Yeah, you're referring to the UK specifically.
In this specific
yeah, it's very interesting because essentially, well, Brazil was the first country to ban conversion therapy in '98, and that was the only other example in history of a partial ban. Every other country, not many countries have banned it, to be fair. I think only like 12 or 15 or so. But those that have banned it completely, because, like you say, the idea of partially banning it makes no sense whatsoever. Sexuality and gender identity, from a psychological standpoint, when you're figuring it, not from a practical standpoint, but from a psychological standpoint, when you're young and you don't know, you have questions, or you're confused about your sexuality or your gender identity, it's all lumped into one. It's not like you say, oh, I must be gay because of this. A lot of the time, like you say, you might think that if you are biologically a woman but you think you might be a man, it could be the case that you're just a lesbian that likes, associates with being masculine more. It's all tied into one. So the idea of banning one form of it but not the other really makes no sense. And what it means is, on a worst case scenario, it means that it basically doesn't do anything, because people can still offer conversion therapy and practice it. But you can say, oh no, it's only gender identity conversion therapy. Don't worry, it's because they're interchangeable. So yeah, there's been a huge uproar against the UK's decision to do this. It's completely absurd, to be honest. And yeah, I think it comes back to the whole, like we were saying earlier, how trans issues are more, people are more hostile towards defending trans rights compared to LGBT rights.
And trans people are also the largest demographic in the UK to receive conversion therapy.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
and this makes me question whether this is a sort of appeasement by the Conservative Party, whose voters who do attract a more religious crowd, a way of this is a way of appeasing voters into still maintaining support, um, retaining that voter stronghold, but also like appearing more forward thinking to more liberal conservatives, but then also being seen as a more retaining some conservatism for more religious factors within the Conservative Party,
yeah,
because it still allows because it becomes shady and uncertain where the line is, because when some people transition, they first come out as gay or a lesbian or as bisexual, and then they transition once they become more included into the LGBT community. And for some people, it's the inverse. They work out that they're trans and non-binary, and then they might explore their sexuality after. And so I see it as a form of appeasing to voters from both sides.
no, you're absolutely right. This is the part where I put on my conspiracy theory hat. The influence of specifically not just the church, but the evangelical church within the government should not be overstated. Um, we know that lobbying occurs in this country to a certain extent, not as much as America, but the evangelical church has a very strong connection to the government. Um, in the meetings that are surrounding this discussion around this ban, the LGBT Alliance, or
The
I can't remember.
LGBT,
Yeah,
the
the
LGBT,
LGBT Alliance or something. Basically, the side representing people who wanted a complete ban. They were consulted once about this, about what the law should look like, and you know what form it should take. However, the evangelical church were contacted multiple times and had really long meetings about this topic. So basically, what I'm trying to say is that the power is not equal. There are certain people who have a much bigger stake in this race than other people, which is, I think, why we see this half ban to a certain extent. Although there is also arguments about how it would affect access to trans healthcare. This is something I didn't bring up in the definition because it's quite important to make a distinction between conversion therapy and general therapy that discusses sexuality and gender identity, right? So obviously the ban does not include banning therapy that discusses people's, obviously if you're uncomfortable about your sexual identity and your gender identity, that's a very common talking point for going to a psychiatrist or anything like that. So, the ban obviously doesn't aim to stop that. The difference between that and conversion therapy is conversion therapy has a fixed goal. It says you think you're gay or you think you're a man, but you're actually not. You're just you're ill, or you're kind of demon if you're in a religious setting, or it's because of past trauma, X, Y, and Z, whatever. And through this therapy, you're going to change and be straight and cisgender again. So,
and once you've done that, you'll be loved and accepted by the community that you're in.
Exactly.
I think that's often underlooked. Because people who are often in these who are put it through conversion therapy often live in cultures, or like in sectors of society where religion is the main focus, um, and therefore the whole community revolves around the church or other faith organizations,
Yeah.
and therefore if you do not fall into line with the beliefs of the church, you could that could be a loss of job, that could be a loss of that could be a loss of all of your social networks, that could be a loss of family connections too. So
Mm,
the stakes for somebody who doesn't go through conversion therapy is really high emotionally,
yeah.
and it kind of lends into, and there is a paranoia when somebody comes out. What relation are my core relationships safe? What is going to change? But this is known as a definite, this is the end of the road if I come out in these, and I do not undertake conversion therapies in these cultures. It isn't maybe one or two people leave, or maybe a specific family member becomes very, very difficult. It is my whole community is uprooted, and maybe my livelihood is uprooted, and I have to start again.
Yeah. Absolutely. On a practical level too, and I do think specifically faith settings, but also in the clinical setting, like they do prey on this idea that like you won't be loved and you won't be accepted, and you're gonna have a horrible life basically, and if you're in a slightly more isolated community, you have no reason to think otherwise. It's like um, we're benefiting more and more from the modern day. So I think this ideal is sort of slowly going away. But if if the only people are straight and cisgender, and they seem happy, and you don't know anybody who's LGBT, you have no reason to believe otherwise, that their lives are horrible, and that they live depressing lives, lonely lives. I think is the biggest thing. You know.
Yeah, the concept of sin is also
Mm,
such a heavy thing within the church, and that how sit and like the idea of sin make feeling horrible, and sit and there's that regret of what the fear of what is going to happen in the future hangs very heavy over you. Um, so there's this also then this fear of the future,
mm,
that you don't know what's going to happen either.
yeah.
So I think, and if you are in one of these more conservative religious groups, there may be also constrictions on your access to media. So,
Yeah.
what are you allowed to read? Are you allowed a phone with internet on it? You allow like these sort of things. Therefore, also affect what access you have to people who disagree with these. Dis- to maybe to It allows you not to speak to people who have different opinions. It means you're enclosed in this bubble where this is the only option.
Yeah. Absolutely. Um, and that's the thing, and that's why I mentioned it earlier, and I think it's the most important thing to think about. Most crucial way to think about conversion therapy is in that it is at its core disrespectful. Because it's one thing to say, which I think is a fair thing to say, is that people who practice conversion therapy and offer it, they aren't good people. However, sometimes they can think that they are doing someone a favor. It's
I'd say they
um,
misinform people.
yeah. So the bottom line is that, I guess, to put it like this, like conversion therapy at its core is disrespectful and discriminatory, right? It's basically saying that your way of life is wrong and you have to change it to be normal. That's obviously at its core discriminatory. However, sometimes in faith settings a lot, and in clinical settings as well, there's this view that they are helping them, that, in fact, because someone's life is worth so much, that they are worthy of being saved. You know what I mean? Like, there's
Mhm.
that view. Um, so it really needs to be emphasized how, no matter what form it takes, it's completely disrespectful and for that reason, it is classified, I think, by um, the UN certainly as degrading treatment. Degrading treatment, if you don't know, is like it's basically the softer form of torture. Um, it's basically an assault on your dignity and devalues you as a person, which is, you know, that's the bottom line about.
Well, practices make you have to almost confess any urges that you've had, any, about intimate thoughts. Did you say at work today, look at, say you work in a cafe, did you at work in a cafe look at a customer and think, oh, they look attractive and they appear to be of the same sex? Or did you look at, is someone at your work, does someone at your work or school identify as gay? Does that does did you have any feelings about that? And you have to therefore concentrate on, you have to disclose a lot of, very intimate thoughts that you don't normally have to on a day-to-day basis. I might go to the bus stop and see somebody go past and think, oh, they're very attractive, but I don't have to share that with anybody. But in conversion therapy, any sentiment at all that could be any private thought, there is no private thoughts. Suddenly you're subjected to this thought police, which criticizes all of your thoughts, all of your memories, even all of the love that you received as a child. Like, it criticizes your family bond. So maybe they say, oh, it's because of abuse or trauma or whatever. But what if that wasn't the case? It then, but it scrutinizes. So it then scrutinizes maybe positive relationships with your family. It completely makes you lose a sense of trust in all of your relationships.
I want to talk about the whole trauma thing, because you're right. There's two aspects to it. One, well, I guess there's three things. One, there's no psychological basis for that thinking that. Obviously, there's plenty of LGBT people who have no trauma, no significant trials of trauma to the extent that they're thinking of, because it's usually in relation to like sexual trauma, right? Like molestation, whatever. But at the same time, everyone has some sort of, not trauma, but something in their adversity when you're a child, when you're going through childhood in some form. And obviously most people aren't LGBT, so that would suggest that it doesn't really have anything to do with it. And of course that's the scientific consensus, is that it doesn't have anything to do with it. But so on one hand, you've got people who haven't gone through any sort of trauma then being gaslit into thinking that they have, and like you say, it worsens your relationship with your family. Maybe you start questioning things, start thinking that you've had a worse relationship with your parents than you have, treating them differently. And on the other hand, if you have been through some sort of trauma, sort of dig that up for no reason and in a very unhealthy way, as because it's not like digging it up to be like, oh, it's okay, you can move on from it. It's digging it up and saying, this is why you're the way you are. This is why you're broken. Disgusting. Yeah, exactly. It's so unhealthy, and it's so horrible, like, to drag someone through that. And it's a whole horrible aspect to it. As a side note, I would recommend, if you want to learn more about this, there's a podcast mini-series from the Times called Thinking Straight, where a journalist actually comes up with this alias, and she goes through conversion therapy with this psychologist. It's pretty harrowing stuff, but it's really interesting to see what techniques they use. It's really rough. But yeah, that's sort of to debunk the whole idea that banning conversion therapy would somehow affect counsel being offered, and also another quick thing to debunk is how it might affect access to trans healthcare. Like the fear that again, you know, that health professionals will be afraid to basically advise someone on their gender identity, and that will affect being given gender dysphoria diagnosis and stuff like that. But you know, obviously, to me, this is an issue nothing to do with conversion therapy. It's to do with access to trans healthcare in general, which is poor. Yeah, in this country specifically. I haven't done enough research about other countries.
The average wait time, I can give you that. The average wait time is 34 months. That's for on the NHS with initial consultation. That's 2 years, 10 months.
Yeah.
But for every procedure you receive as a trans person, you require 2 signatures from 2 doctors. Now, each gender clinic works differently, but most give you 1 appointment, then you wait for the next appointment, and then you get hormones. And there can be over a year between appointments. So whilst you might get seen for your initial consultation at 3 years, 10 months, it won't be until 3 years, 10 months that you will then get the signature, and then it can be another 2 months before you get that letter processed to your GP. So it's actually 4 years before you get your initial treatment.
Yeah.
After disclosing to your GP that you're trans. That there is also something within trans healthcare called a bridging prescription, which is when you go to your GP and say, I think I'm trans, I can't wait for the gender clinic, it's too long, I would like a bridging prescription. And most doctors say no. And the main reason is over 70% have said they don't feel confident in prescribing hormones, whereas the information is there and it's quite easy to find. And it's often given at a lower dose, but they often don't. They will only do it if the trans person has disclosed suicidality, significant risks of significant self-harm, or they have found a source of hormones that is not prescribed by a doctor and they intend to take it, such as self-injecting. And that is when the doctor feels there is the risk of not having access to hormones outweighs the need for hormones. But this often is refused. So anyway, so you can say all of those things to the doctor and the doctor won't do anything about it, which kind of goes to show how difficult how difficult it is to access hormones on the NHS, whereas a menopausal woman can go into the doctor and say, I would like to start HRT, I'm finding the menopause really challenging. It's one of the most prescribed drugs in the country, access to estradiol, and she can get it immediately. Whereas the wait for a trans person is far greater.
Yeah, and there's no reason why there's a distinction there. I just think it's so ridiculous how they don't feel comfortable offering hormones, but they're so comfortable giving literally anything else under the sun, like antidepressants that can cause all sorts of things. I don't know, it's ridiculous stuff. But yeah, like there's obviously no evidence to show that banning conversion therapy would in any way make this worse. If anything, it would make it better because, you know, you mentioned before how trans people are more likely to offer conversion therapy, and that's true. One thing that is also true, generally safe settings are the most common occurrence for conversion therapy, but with trans people specifically, it's slightly more common, still more common in safe settings, but slightly more common to experience it in a clinical setting. And I think that does have something to do with the fact that obviously trans people are inherently linked to the medical profession. You know, they obviously are required by law to get a gender dysphoria diagnosis, which can then often at times trigger conversion therapy without them even realizing it. You know, people telling them that they're actually not transgender and all this stuff. So if anything, allowing conversion therapy specifically for gender identity can make these times even longer because you get curtailed with people telling you that you're actually not and trying to direct you to being cisgender again. It's just, yeah, it's a stupid argument because Um, and yeah, and I guess one last thing about the whole religious argument as well. Uh, like you said, that there's a lot of fear from the evangelical community about banning conversion therapy, basically restricting their religious rights. Now, uh, whenever you have human rights, there's always going to be conflicting rights. That's just the way it is. If you want better security and better safety, which is a human right, then you have to sometimes restrict people's right to liberty. And it's the same here. If you want to make people's right to private life, right to their own sexuality better, you do often have to restrict religious expression, right to religious expression. But specifically, there's no restriction on religious expression that has anything, normal religious expression, like being able to go to church or wear a cross or anything like that. The only religious expression that is being suppressed is that which is inherently discriminatory. And that's the distinction, that discriminatory speech and expression is not protected under human rights law. So obviously conversion therapy fits squarely within that. As I said before, it's inherently discriminatory. I'm not going to pretend that. Yeah, go on.
Also, religious practice also infringes on the Gender Recognition Act, which is another law that trans people. So currently, the Gender Recognition Act was brought into place in 2004 and allowed people to change their gender legally and get a gender recognition certificate. Yeah. But it is still a difficult process. You still have to. It's still medicalized. You still need to have a doctor's letter evidencing your history of gender dysphoria, and this could be surgeries, this could be hormones, or it could just be accessing a gender identity service. And then also, if you wish to marry, you have to ask permission of your spouse prior to it. And any marriages where a partner transitioned, so they were married after 2004, but they transitioned prior to 2014. Those marriages were all immediately annulled in order for the person. So again, this also shows that there is a sort of sanctity of marriage, and that I think religious groups claw onto, and that it is not accessible to the trans community as well as the wider LGBT community. But it is still, the idea of transition within marriage is still not is less accessible, because you have to ask permission to get to change the group to be legally recognised as the correct gender.
That's absolutely insane. It's insane when you think about that. That's what women have to do. That's like think about it like that. And the idea that would be the case today is absurd. So the fact that that's the case for trans people is absolutely ridiculous.
And there was a reform in 2020 after a consultation, and the only reform was that the process was made cheaper.
Yeah.
That is the only thing that has changed. Nothing else has changed. The process has not been made. The rights of trans people in the gender have not been made any smoother, apart from the fact that you don't have to pay £140, you only have to pay £5, which still brings into this ideology that trans people are mentally ill, that trans people should not be even loved by their partner, and that for their trans identity, and there's also still no recognition for non-binary and intersex people.
Yeah.
This is which is also, the church focuses on the idea of a man and a woman. A non-binary person, again, is not something the church can conceptualize. So this again also comes into effect with conversion therapy, that these identities should not be seen. I think something else that kind of wants people focus on with trans people is the sort of obsession with regret and detransition, and how people get indoctrinated into how transition is going to make your life better, see, like magically better, everything's going to be better, but then actually you realize it doesn't remove your problems, and then you realize the problem wasn't your difficulty, your dysphoria, it was actually something else. But I want to be clear, the rate of regret is incredibly low. The rate of regret for a trans person is somewhere between 1 and 2%, whereas, and that's the rate of regret for hormones. That's the rate of regret for surgery. However, a breast reconstruction, the rate of regret is 47%. So I think people are I think trans people know what they want. And even when people do detransition, the majority of the time, they might detransition from, say, if they were born female, they might detransition from a trans man, but they will never be an effeminate cis woman. Most of the time, if they detransition, they might detransition to non-binary, or they might detransition to a masculine woman. A full detransition to is not that common.
Biologically as well.
No, I don't mean biologically, because as long as you haven't had a hit, like most people when they transition, they first start off by taking hormones, but it's not until much later that they will have their sexual reproductive organs removed. So most people get, I think the point where most people start to reach a point of regret, the latest is about 4 years. And after 4 years, if people want to detransition, they detransition. By that 4 years, most people haven't had their sexual organs removed. So they just come off their hormones, and the reproductive organs that they had at birth just are no longer suppressed, and they start to excrete the estrogen or testosterone and progesterone, the hormones that they were given at birth. If somebody has had their sexual organs removed, they then have to start taking. They still have to take hormones, but they have to say chemically take estrogen, or they have to take testosterone. But the rate of regret is really low. Yet the fear mongering is so high, and this is kind of shown by the case Bell versus Tavistock in 2020, where a detransitioned woman, so a woman who was assigned female at birth, transitioned to male, and then detransitioned to female. She was under the Tavistock Clinic, which is the children's clinic in the UK, and she said that she was forced to make a decision to transition which she didn't want to make. And she won her case. And the consequence for this was that children now trying to access gender clinics can no longer consent if they are Gillick competent. Gillick competency is when a child under 16 who can show that they shows the ability to show consent and show balance and risk in their understandings. That is when somebody can consent in a mature way, and they show they have capacity, because full adult capacity is not something that everybody has, and it's something you have to be assessed for when you make a medical decision. But this case, Bell v Tavistock, shows that the fear mongering and the transphobia that permeates our system is so strong. So even if like conversion therapy, the conversion therapy not being banned allows this sentiment that trans people should not have the right to access to care, and the more vulnerable trans people should not have access to treatment in children. There is also a link between autism and trans identity, and increasingly it is finding that people who are autistic and trans are 6 times more prevalent in the trans population than the cis population. And again, this is now bringing into the thing, is this gender dysphoria real? Do these people have capacity? Yes, they do. They do have capacity. But again, there's this niggling thing of transphobia where people are not, where people's capacity is not accepted because of because they have differences, and conversion therapy and not like and allowing certain sex, allowing trans people not to have access to conversion therapy is saying it's still not okay to be trans, and these sentiments can continue to pervade the British legal system and medical system, and can continue to make the most vulnerable trans people vulnerable to transphobia and institutional transphobia.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. I mean, there's no reasoning beyond transphobia for that decision to come to the decision it made. I mean, Gillick was a very clear case. I mean, if you're willing to say on a legal basis, which I think is right, if a child is showing competence, it shows understanding, it shows risk, there's no reason why you should deny it choice, and there's no reason why you shouldn't take its consent at face value. And the only reason that it was overridden in the Bell case is because of transphobia. I think that's pretty. I mean, that's pretty reasonable to say that. That's not really like speculation. That's just like a fact, pretty much. So yeah, it really does show how pervasive transphobia is in the system. It's going to be a while, I think, before it goes away. Unfortunately, I think this recent business with conversion therapy has shown that it's more pervasive than ever. So yeah, but obviously, looking optimistically to the future, I guess there are apparently plans to modify the law about conversion therapy, so there's that at least. But yeah, I don't know. Hopefully this has been educational to everybody that didn't know about this sort of stuff. Let's get one more thing as well. Oh yeah. Well, I think that the whole issue, since we're talking about Gillick as well, I think the whole issue of consent comes to play in everything that we've talked about. The whole issue of whether trans people are really consenting to it. If it's for some reason that their consent is not viewed as equal to other people's consent, because they're seen as, again, it does come back to them being seen as irrational and stuff. But interestingly, there was a distinction about conversion therapy originally, whether it was consensual or not. Originally, the ban was going to be only for people under 18 and for non-consensual people, basically. Thankfully, the government changed their mind about that, because the reality is that nobody is going to make informed consent about conversion therapy, because, like I said, it doesn't work. And if you want to go through with it, it's based on the idea that you are inadequate or broken or, something like that. So there's no way that you would consent to it unless you thought like that.
And these sentiments still very much exist in the population today.
Yeah.
I think Nigel Owens, who's quite a famous rugby referee who's gay, he went to the doctor and asked for chemical castration because he was so appalled about the fact he was gay. So these people who are coming to terms with their identity are extremely vulnerable, and they can be easily manipulated into feeling they are wrong because of the historical stigma that still lies about with it about being LGBTQ plus. There
Yeah.
is, and especially in being trans,
Yeah.
there is still this sentiment of perversion and mental illness and being a heinous person who participates in drugs and rapes people
Mm,
and is a paedophile, and those thoughts and abuses women. Those thoughts still are the undercurrent
yeah.
of what of in the back of the psyche of people's minds. People still think that, and it's because it's still in our television. If you look at Ace
Definitely.
Ventura, that plays a joke on trans people. Trans Ricky Gervais is still making anti-trans jokes.
Oh my
This
God.
the anti-trans sentiment is still very, very strong, and only 10 years ago was anti-gay sentiment very, very strong too. So
Yeah.
I think it's not um to think that this is, this is hundreds of years of thought process that we're having to unpick, and the church is still powerful. So I think it's going to take politically powerful. It's going to take a lot to overcome that political power and to
Mm,
continue to fight the stigma that the general public who aren't queer see.
absolutely.
As long as it's acceptable to make anti-trans jokes on television, and there is still somebody on the BBC saying, but is it really real being trans? Like,
Mm,
there is still going to be people who agree with that because they don't know any better.
yes, I think, yeah, as long as they're the whole like turf crowd, I think as long as it's I mean, look, they're obviously very heavily criticized, but only by certain groups of people, and I think as long as it's continued to be seen as like, I think it's almost seen as this weird like middle ground, when if anything it's really not. It's like very, it's quite far right, really. Like, um, you
Well,
know, it's
I don't think so. I don't think turfs that I don't think have are because turfs are all over the Labour Party too. It's why Labour can't give
mm,
a strong a, anti turf sentiment, because there are still very powerful turfs in the Labour Party. Um,
yeah, but it's
it's
still based on the idea of like, um, you know, restricting people's access to resources and to spaces.
mm,
Um, I don't know. The point, I guess, yeah, my point mainly is that it's not. It shouldn't be seen as like. It should be viewed in the same way as like people who say like, well, aren't all Muslim terrorists? You know, it's like it's essentially the same line of thinking. It's like stereotypes and fear mongering that has evolved into, you know, coherent sentences, basically.
yeah.
That's what it comes down to. Yeah. Did you have anything else to add?
Um, I think to sum up, the views on trans people in this country are still tied to religious sentiment and to the stigma of mental illness, and that trans people are inherently mentally ill. I
Yeah.
think in order to change in order to change the public sentiment, which will change these laws, we need to address those stigmas, and we need to tackle the power that the church has over our policies.
Absolutely. I think you hit the nail on the head there. So, thanks very much for listening. Hope you learned something. And goodbye.